Charles Scott Robinson holds the record for the longest prison sentence in US history, 30,000 years. In 1994, Robinson was convicted in Oklahoma of 6 counts of child rape, crimes so heinous that the judge delivered a sentence of 5,000 years for each count to be served consecutively. Robinson's case shocked the nation due to the egregious nature of his crimes. His victims were children under the age of 10, and the evidence presented in court left no room for doubt. Prosecutors described how Robinson used his position of trust to manipulate and harm these vulnerable children. The lengthy sentence was intended not only as a punishment, but also as a message to society about the severity of such crimes. Despite the staggering length, Robinson's sentence was largely symbolic. He would never be eligible for parole or see the outside of a prison cell again. His case continues to stand out as an example of the US justice system's response to unspeakable crimes against children. Alan Wayne McLaren was sentenced to an astounding 21,250 years in Oklahoma for a series of violent crimes, including rape, robbery, and kidnapping. His crime spree, committed alongside his partner Darren Benelford Anderson, left several victims traumatized. In 1994, both men were convicted of their horrific acts. During their trial, victims provided harrowing testimony, detailing the violent assaults and the psychological torment they endured. Initially, Anderson received a 2,200-year sentence, but after a retrial, his punishment increased to over 11,000 years. McLaurin's longer sentence reflected his direct role in the most brutal aspects of the crimes. The extraordinary sentence ensured that McLaren would never be released, emphasizing the court's stance on the severity of his actions. It also served to provide closure to the victims, knowing he would remain behind bars for life, and then some. This case remains one of the most extreme examples of lengthy sentencing in US history. Dudley Wayne Kaiser was sentenced to 10,000 years in prison for the 1976 murder of his wife, along with 2 life sentences for the killings of his mother-in-law and a college student. His crime was brutal, shocking the small Alabama community where it occurred. Kaiser murdered his estranged wife Diane on Halloween night. After shooting her, he turned his weapon on her mother and a young student who happened to be at the home. The sheer cold-bloodedness of the crime left the community reeling. During the trial, prosecutors painted Kaiser as a man consumed by rage and jealousy, unwilling to let his wife move on. The presiding judge handed down the maximum penalties, including the extraordinary 10,000-year sentence for his wife's murder, ensuring that Kaiser would never again walk free. This sentence reflected both the horror of his crimes and the court's desire to send a clear message. Such heinous acts would be met with the harshest punishment possible. James Egan Holmes received 12 consecutive life sentences, plus 3,318 years for the 2012 mass shooting in Aurora, Colorado.
In Colorado, a mother is trying to save the life of her son. The mother of James Holmes, convicted of murdering 12 people in an Aurora movie theater, testified today in the sentencing phase of his trial.
This tragic event took place during a midnight screening of The Dark Knight Rises, leaving 12 dead and 70 injured.
Murder trial heard more from the defendant in his videotaped interview with a court-appointed psychiatrist. Holmes had pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity in the Colorado movie theater massacre that left 12 people dead and 70 injured.
Holmes, armed with multiple firearms, entered the packed theater and opened fire without warning.
Holmes's Aurora apartment were detonated the day after the shooting.
His actions were calculated, as he had previously booby-trapped his apartment to cause further harm to responders.
Movie theater shooting suspect James Holmes looked dazed in court. He sat with a blank stare multiple times during the 25-minute hearing, that stare captured in this sketch.
His arrest was swift, and during his trial, the defense argued that Holmes suffered from severe mental illness. However, prosecutors highlighted the premeditated nature of the attack. The jury ultimately rejected the insanity defense.
The judge gave the prosecution permission to start forensic testing of weapons believed to be used in the theater shooting. This footage from Air Tracker 7, the morning of the shooting, shows one weapon on the roof of the car believed to be driven by Holmes.
And Holmes was spared the death penalty, but sentenced to life without parole.
The death penalty decision has to be made within 60 days of the arraignment. Okay. So it is months down the line still.
The additional 3,318 years were for attempted murders and explosives charges, symbolizing the gravity of the devastation he caused.
I would have been crawling on all fours to get to him. He's never said that he wanted to kill people. She didn't tell me.
Holmes's case remains one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history. Highlighting the devastating impact of mass shootings.
In a poll out this week, Jane, 63% say they believe Holmes should be executed.
Sholom Weiss received one of the longest sentences for white-collar crime in U.S. history. "845 years in federal prison. His crimes revolved around a massive insurance fraud scheme that led to the collapse of the National Heritage Life Insurance Company in the 1990s.
On February 15, 2000, the Middle District Court of Florida sentenced Weiss to 845 years in prison for racketeering, wire fraud, money laundering, and the interstate transportation of stolen funds.
Weiss and his accomplices defrauded the company of over $450 million, leaving thousands of policyholders, many of them elderly, without their life savings. The scale of the operation was staggering, involving complex financial manipulations and offshore accounts. After his conviction, Weiss fled the U.S., but he was eventually captured in Austria and extradited back to face justice. The court handed down the 845-year sentence to reflect the immense financial and emotional harm inflicted on the victims. Weiss's story is a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of corporate greed and the lengths to which the justice system will go to hold perpetrators accountable. If you would like to see more morbid law stories, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching.